Hi, everyone, and welcome to our interview session with Tim Lawless. Tim is the head and founder of the research division of CoreLogic, previously called RP Data. We know when it comes to property data, CoreLogic is an absolutely unrivaled guru. Tim is a household name in the sector, and undoubtedly, a lot of our followers will be excited to get his insights. Let's say hi to Tim. Tim, thanks so much for your time.
G'day, Shapur, and thank you for inviting me along, mate. It's great to be able to engage with the Persian community through your channel.
Thanks, my pleasure. Tim, to put our conversation in perspective, let's have a glance at what constituted the recipe for the super strong housing demand and the huge upsurge in property prices in Australia post-pandemic.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. So it's not just one thing. A lot of people point to interest rates, of course, coming down as low as what they have. But there's a lot of other factors that have really driven this growth cycle in Australia. So even leading into the pandemic, there are already events happening that set up this growth phase. For example, between the middle of 2017 and the middle of 2019, we were seeing housing values generally falling across Australia. So we saw affordability really improve over the 2 years leading into the pandemic. And then as we saw in the middle of 2019, there was a federal election in Australia. So that election removed a lot of the uncertainty around taxation policy changes relating to housing. And then we started to see credit policies just loosening up a little bit around July of 2019, and interest rates starting to come down a little bit before that. So we're already starting to see the early phase of a growth cycle before the pandemic actually hit. And then as the pandemic hit in around March of 2020, we did see the housing market respond negatively. We generally saw housing values falling. We saw rents falling as confidence was disrupted. But quite quickly, the market turned around, and it turned around very rapidly. And the reasons that really drove that turnaround, which then turned into this recent growth phase, were a mix of monetary and fiscal policy initiatives. So what I mean by that is we saw interest rates come down to new record lows quite quickly. So that's the monetary policy response. Along with that monetary policy response, we also saw lenders getting access to very cheap credit through the term funding facility that the Reserve Bank put forward. And then outside of any sort of quantitative easing that we saw later down the track, we also saw a lot of fiscal support for the economy. So there were some cash handouts, there was incentives to build a home, the home builder program. So there's a lot of incentives to actually be active in the economy. And then amongst all that, we saw a few other things happening. We saw consumers became really confident. And we know that consumer confidence and housing markets have a really strong relationship. When households feel confident in the economy, confident in their ability to hold a job, they're generally in a much better position to make a high commitment purchasing decision like buying property. So confidence was right up here. We saw households saving a lot more as well through the pandemic, which made it easier for them to get a deposit together and to demonstrate their serviceability to the banks as well. So a lot of factors really drove this upswing. And then another factor on top of that high demand was that we saw very low listing numbers across Australia. There wasn't very many properties available to purchase. So while we saw demand reach new record highs, the number of home sales reached new record highs, we saw the number of homes available for sale were tracking around about a third below what you might describe as a normal. So strong demand, really low supply. The obvious outcome is going to be a lot of upwards pressure on housing prices.
Absolutely. Tim, I recall I mentioned this even in a podcast right after the pandemic hit back in 2020, that over decades, the Australian government has become quite adept at creating what I consider artificial demand by utilizing a variety of incentive packages and successfully boost and uplift the economy. I believe this led to what we saw in the property market in the last year or so.
Pretty much, absolutely. And generally, marketing 101 is supply and demand. So a few levers were pulled that really pushed demand into the marketplace, and there simply wasn't an adequate supply response, which saw housing prices rise.
Definitely. I absolutely agree. So most probably we can assume it comes down to a matter of supply and demand, meaning that all these elements play with the demand side and the supply side. And as the result of this interplay between the demand side and the supply side, post-pandemic, we came up with a market that turned out to be highly exceptional. Would you agree?
I think that's a fair enough description. And it's probably also fair to say that a lot of those demand side drivers are now starting to lose some of their potency. They're not quite as strong as they used to be. And for that reason, we're starting to see the rate of growth is already easing across Australian housing markets and starting to see less activity as well.
Tim, we noticed that in the federal budget, there's a tendency to create more demand in a specific sector of the property market. This has created serious concerns about the already diminishing affordability levels. We'll, of course, talk about affordability later on, but do you see this new line as causing significantly more demand in the market or no?
Yeah, so you're referring to incentives for first home buyers, specifically helping them to get across some of the hurdles of accessing the market. But the hardest one, or the biggest one, is raising a 20% deposit for most first home buyers. And that's exactly the policy that the government are releasing into the marketplace, allowing first home buyers to get into the marketplace with as small a deposit as 5%. And then the federal government guarantees the remainder up to 20%. That essentially means first home buyers, they don't have to save for as long. They can get into the marketplace, avoid paying rent for too long, and not have to, in Sydney, for example, the typical first home buyer might need to save for, say, 10 years, if not more than that, to save a 20% deposit. So it definitely provides a bit of a leg up to first home buyers to get into the market. It overcomes one of the major obstacles for accessing the housing market. But in the same sense, to your earlier point, it doesn't really do anything to tackle the underlying issues of housing affordability. In fact, it probably even makes it worse because you're pushing more demand into the marketplace without really trying to deliver a solution to what's causing a worsening affordability situation in the first place. So seeing both a supply side response as well as helping first home buyers into the marketplace would be a much more legitimate position for the government. And it was definitely one of the findings from the recent Housing Affordability and Supply Report, or the Felinsky Review, as some people call it, where they did have a series of 16 odd recommendations. And one of the key ones was any incentives in the marketplace should be accompanied by a commensurate level of supply additions. Yeah, so we are moving through a construction boom at the moment, and that's part and parcel with the home builder program that expired back in March of last year. So we are seeing more supply coming into the Australian market, but for a lot of first home buyers, accessing a newly built market is still quite challenging, especially at the moment as we see construction costs rising at around a bit more than 7% per annum. Land costs are rising very quickly. And a lot of the new construction projects that are underway at the moment are getting delayed due to supply chain constraints, due to higher construction costs, and finding appropriate levels of trades and labour.
In comparison with the ever-increasing bulk of demand that we always see in the property market, supply seems to be infinitesimal. Now, moving a bit away from the past to familiarize our viewers with the current landscape of the property market, we know there are many players out there impacting the trajectory of the real estate market. To begin with, I'd appreciate a touch upon the likely impact of perhaps imminent interest rate rises on property prices. I said perhaps imminent because I want to know your views on that one too. Thank you.
I think interest rates, or when we talk about interest rates, we're generally talking about the cash rate, which the Reserve Banks, and then that obviously flows into mortgage rates as well. So there is some speculation that we will see the cash rate moving higher imminently, to use your words, potentially in June, maybe July, maybe August or September. The timing is highly uncertain. The Reserve Bank met just this week. It was on Tuesday. They always meet on the first Tuesday of the month. And it does look like from the statement that accompanied that meeting afterwards, it does look like the Reserve Bank is becoming just a little bit more hawkish. They dropped some of the key words that they've used in the past, like the fact that they generally use the word like patient, that they're patient to wait for data evidence which will show that inflation is going to be holding sustainably within their target range, that labor markets are tight enough to create wages growth sufficient to keep inflation high. They've dropped a bit of that language now, which a lot of people have taken as a hint that we could be seeing the cash rate moving higher, maybe as early as June, so only 2 months away. Potentially it'll be a little bit later than that, maybe in July, because that'll give the RBA some time to see what inflation's doing as well as wages growth. But regardless of the timing, it is pretty clear we're going to see the cash rate moving higher this year, probably upwards over several consecutive meetings. But remember, this is the context is really important. We've currently got a cash rate in Australia of 0.1%, so 10 basis points. It's never been that low. And if you look at the long-term average of the cash rate, it's going to take a long time for mortgage rates or the cash rate to get back to what you might describe as average. The 10-year average is about 1.7%, right? So we need to see a lot of movements before interest rates normalize. Chances are we will see interest rates rising, but not getting close to those average levels within the space of a couple of years. But overall, higher interest rates are clearly a downside risk for housing. Higher interest rates, there's nothing really positive there for the housing market, apart from the fact that interest rates are probably going to be rising because the economy is strengthening, because wages growth is strong, because labor markets are tight. So that should help to offset any material downwards pressure in housing prices. But there will be some level of a downturn across Australia. I think we're probably already seeing Sydney and Melbourne entering into the first phases of a downturn, and other regions around the country will follow with somewhat of a lag.
Sure. Tim, presumably a relevant determining factor is APRA's regulatory intervention to minimize credit risk. What are your thoughts on the odds of APRA's involvement in this stage of the property market, and how would such regulatory intervention probably impact the market at this stage?
Well, we've already seen APRA wade into the marketplace late last year. That was in October last year. And we saw APRA tighten the serviceability buffer by 50 basis points. It simply means that if you're applying for a loan that's got an interest rate of, say, 3%, the bank will be assessing you 3 percentage points above that, so ability to pay back at a 6% mortgage rate. So we've already seen APRA become a little bit more active. That was more tinkering around the edges, to be frank. I don't think it's really had any material effect on borrowers' ability to get a loan just yet. Any further risk of APRA coming into the marketplace and maybe tightening credit policies further, it's still there, but I don't think it's quite as large a risk as what we're seeing late last year. And the reason I would say that is we're starting to see some signs that credit growth, housing credit growth, is just starting to ease off a little. It's still above income growth, which is a bit of a worry. And we're also seeing other factors around, most of the focus from APRA is on high debt to income ratio lending. So a loan that's got a debt to income ratio greater than 6 times, meaning the borrower's debt level is more than 6 times higher than their income, that's generally where banks become much more cautious. And the good news for credit policy is, even though last quarter we saw a bit of an increase in high debt to income ratio loans, the increase between the September quarter and the December quarter was quite small. It looks like that trend is starting to level off to me, which I think is probably lenders becoming much more cautious without any policy change. Lenders just taking it on themselves to make sure they're not overexposing themselves to high DTI lending. So if we did see APRA turning the screws a little bit, then again, that's another downside risk for housing. We know that credit availability is one of the key factors in the housing market's performance. And you just need to look back to, say, 2015 and 2017, when we saw previous rounds of macroprudential, that did have a fairly significant and prolonged impact on credit availability, which saw houses coming backwards through both the macroprudential and the Royal Commission, which saw credit availability tighten up even further.
Well put. Thank you very much. Now, apart from the interest rates or macroprudential policies, do you expect banks to become more risk averse in this current loan market? We certainly know if this happens, it tends to put downward pressure on property prices. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's logical to expect banks will become a little bit more cautious. That's normal through a housing down phase, and also amidst a lot of uncertainty as well. You know, within this housing boom we're moving through at the moment, there's been a lot of changes to the environment. You know, different types of population growth or different areas that are experiencing population growth, border closures and border reopenings. So the outlook for housing is still a little bit murky. There's a lot of moving parts. So my best guess is that we probably will see lenders a little bit more cautious than what they were through an upswing. Just being careful of low deposit lending, for example. That they'll probably really be looking for trying to get a loan book that's more skewed towards lower LVRs. So deposit or lender borrowers, that have say a 20% deposit will be very favorably looked upon. Borrowers with low debt levels relative to their incomes will probably be treated favorably as well. And what I mean by treated favorably simply means they'll probably, banks price risk. And if you don't have a large deposit, or if you do have a larger level of debt, chances are you'll be paying a higher interest rate than somebody who has a large deposit or a lower level of debt relative to their incomes.
Sure, that's for sure. Now, post-COVID, a lot of things have changed, Tim, and patterns of population mobility changed as well. They were not an exception. On the one hand, immigration from overseas halted due to lockdowns. On the other, apart from tree changing or sea changing, species have shown different preferences that have led to different interstate migration. Based on available data, are these trends changing, or are we going to see more of this interstate migration in the midterm and long-term future?
Yeah, the unfortunate thing about Australian population data is it's really lagged. The most recent data on regional migration is up to date as of the previous financial year. And we won't see an update on that for nearly another year now, unfortunately. So I'll answer your question anecdotally, Shapur. And I think I'm based in a regional market, by the way. I'm on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and I can see it all around me, where we've seen Queensland experiencing an absolute surge in interstate migration. More people arriving, particularly in the southeast corner, in Brisbane, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba, arriving from New South Wales and Victoria mostly. And we have seen this trend before. It was back in about 2002, 2003, we were seeing a fairly similar rate of interstate migration that really drives housing demand. Interstate migration is much more important than overseas migration for housing purchasing, because there's real demand. It's generally people are coming over the border, they're looking to buy a home, rather than overseas migration. Generally, it drives rental demand, at least initially, and then has a gradual flow through to purchasing demand. One of the factors that's driving this regional trend and the interstate migration trend is, well, a lot more people can work remotely now, and that seems to have a bit of permanency to it. So it makes markets like Brisbane or the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast or Adelaide or Perth or some of the regional markets like Newcastle and Wollongong, for example, Geelong, it makes those markets much more attractive because people can base themselves in these markets. They can have a lifestyle dividend or a lifestyle improvement because they're close to the coast, or they're tree change style areas. But quite often, they're more affordable than living or buying in Sydney and Melbourne as well. So they get this dual benefit of a bit of a lifestyle upgrade. They can buy into the housing market a bit more affordably. And that's been a real key factor in driving these demographic changes. How long it's going to last is a lot harder to answer because nobody really knows this just yet. I think the areas that probably will have some longevity are those regional markets or those capital cities that offer up some diversity in their economy, as well as regional markets that are within commuting distance back to the major capitals. Say a 2-hour driving distance seems to be the magical ring around a capital city, for example, where we are expecting some of those regional trends will probably persist. Once you get a bit further out from that, then it's much harder to commute back into the capitals. And it does look like most employers, businesses that have been allowing their staff to work remotely, they're starting to adopt hybrid policies now where they expect their staff in the office maybe 2 days a week. They can work from home 3 days a week, which really implies you need to be within a reasonable commuting distance. Even at 2 hours, you're not going to be doing that every day, but you have to do it 1 or 2 days a week. It's probably acceptable.
Tim, back in 2000, 2001, I took a number of trips to Japan where on one occasion I took the Shinkansen, that's the Japanese word meaning the bullet train, to pave the long distance between Tokyo and Kitakyushu in just 4 hours. If such bullet trains enter the public transport system in Australia, I assume a 2-hour drive would be like going to the block next door. Isn't that so?
Absolutely. And, if we had something like a bullet train here in Australia connecting some of the big regional cities to the major capitals, I mean, that's a big step forward in solving our housing affordability problem, right? We have a lot of affordable housing in Australia. It just tends to be located a long way from where most of the jobs are. So, yeah, I've been a big fan of infrastructure improvements, particularly transport infrastructure improvements that open up a lot of these regional, more affordable markets. And that's a great example. The bullet trains in Japan just open up such a vast amount of land where housing is much more affordable. And often those lifestyle factors are more appealing as well.
Sure. And I'm making reference to a train in Japan back in 2000 and 2001. And if a Japanese listens to me right now, they would laugh and say, this is history now. But in Australia, we're still wishing to have a glimpse of such a thing. Tim, I can continue this interview for good. I generally enjoyed the smooth flow and the first-hand data you presented here. I hope to be joined by you again in our future podcast. Thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you, Shapur. It was an absolute pleasure to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much.